Alexander Hayes was the kind of man who could command any room he entered. His presence, marked by piercing eyes and undeniable charisma, compelled allies and rivals alike to bow under the weight of his influence. He ruled over a vast empire, built through decades of bold, uncompromising decisions. Nothing seemed impossible for him. Yet even the strongest empires conceal cracks that can widen under the right pressure. At a business dinner, savoring a vintage wine with Richard Monroe, his longtime partner and confidant, Alexander mentioned a multi-million-dollar deal he'd just closed. Richard smiled, raising his glass. "You've got the Midas touch," he said, but something in his tone fell off. It was a mix of admiration and something else. Alexander didn't notice at the time, or perhaps chose to ignore it. He had always believed his unshakable confidence was his greatest asset. A week later, an anonymous email landed in his legal team's inbox, questioning the integrity of some recent financial transactions. Alexander greeted the news with a mix of irritation and disdain. "Another jealous nobody trying to tarnish my reputation," he said, tossing the tablet onto the glass table in his penthouse. His assistant, Amanda, suggested an investigation. "Not worth my time," he replied, convinced it was just noise. But the noise grew louder. In a meeting with a long-standing client, the conversation veered toward rumors that had started circulating. The client, visibly uneasy, interrupted the negotiation to say they needed to evaluate the situation before moving forward with the contract. Alexander, used to being in complete control, left the meeting with clenched fists. None of it made sense. Deep down, he knew something was wrong, but wasn't ready to admit it. Richard tried to reassure him. "These things come and go. The biggest sharks always draw the most attacks," he said with a comforting smile. Alexander nodded, but he couldn't ignore the fleeting look in Richard's eyes, as if he was weighing every word. It was a nearly imperceptible detail, but it stuck with him. A few days later, the storm broke. A formal subpoena was delivered by a court officer, bringing accusations of embezzlement and corruption. The attached documents were so detailed, they sent his legal team into a frenzy. Alexander refused to believe it. "This is a joke," he told Amanda, who looked just as shaken as he was. But the evidence seemed irrefutable. The media was relentless. Headlines like Alexander Hayes, the fraud king, dominated the front pages. Photos of him at lavish events were used to paint him as a corporate villain, while social media erupted with damning opinions. "I built this with my own hands," he told his lawyer, his voice trembling with indignation. "And now they want to destroy it all with lies." Inside his company, the tension was palpable. Meetings that were once productive turned into arenas of distrustful glances. Amanda, always a pillar of stability, seemed to avoid eye contact. Directors began making unilateral decisions, bracing for a future without Alexander at the helm. Even Richard, his staunchest ally, grew evasive, suggesting Alexander step back until this all blows over. The sense of isolation was suffocating. That night, Alexander sat alone in his office, surrounded by papers and reports, trying to uncover a pattern that could expose the deception. But the evidence was so meticulously crafted that even he, for a fleeting moment, doubted his own memory. How could they know so much? Who had access to this level of detail? Then the realization struck him like a thunderclap. This wasn't a random attack. It was personal. And worse, the enemy was close. Memories began to align. Offhand comments, inexplicable decisions, glances he had previously dismissed. Richard. His name pierced through the veil of Alexander's trust like a knife. But he still needed proof and a plan. The next morning, Alexander stared at his reflection in the mirror. His gaze held the determination that had carried him to the top. But now it was tempered with something new, desperation. He knew he was being hunted. He knew his empire was crumbling. But he also knew that to survive, he'd have to do the unthinkable. And so, the seed of a mad idea began to take root. fake his own death. In the days that followed, Alexander was consumed by a volatile mix of anger and frustration. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. But this time, the enemy seemed to have anticipated every move, every resource he might use to defend himself. The fabricated evidence had not only destroyed his reputation, but also put everything he had built into question. The weight of isolation was unbearable. Even Amanda, whom he had always considered loyal, seemed hesitant when answering his questions. With each encounter with Richard, Alexander felt as though he were speaking to a stranger. His partner maintained a supportive tone, but something in his eyes betrayed his words. Richard began to suggest that maybe it was time for Alexander to step away from the company. "It's temporary," he said. "Just until things cool down." Alexander knew that if he took that step, it would be the end. But the walls were closing in, and he needed a way out. Alone in his penthouse, Alexander began to entertain an idea as absurd as it was radical: faking his own death. He knew that as long as he remained alive and visible, he would be hunted and condemned before he could mount a defense. He needed time to uncover who was behind the conspiracy and clear his name. The decision didn't come easily. Alexander spent sleepless nights weighing his options. He could flee to another country, but that would only delay the inevitable. He could face the charges head-on, but he knew the system was rigged against him. Disappearing seemed more and more like the only viable solution. He began planning with the same meticulous precision that had made him a millionaire. The location of the accident was crucial. After weeks of research, he decided that a car crash on a remote road would be convincing yet discreet enough to avoid extended investigation. He studied similar cases, analyzing every detail that made an accident conclusive in the eyes of the authorities. He knew he needed to leave just enough evidence to sustain the narrative. The next step was execution. Alexander purchased a used car, swapping out the license plates to avoid tracking. He scouted a secluded road near a dense forest, rehearsing the accident in his mind dozens of times, fine-tuning every detail to ensure perfection. The farewell was the hardest part. Alexander couldn't trust anyone, not even Amanda. He began withdrawing gradually, leaving vague remarks that could be interpreted as signs of exhaustion. "Maybe I need some time to think," he told Richard during a meeting. His partner seemed relieved. "That's a good idea," Richard replied, unable to hide his smile. On the night of the accident, Alexander drove to the chosen location with a calmness that even he found unsettling. The road was deserted, and the silence around him amplified every sound: the hum of the engine, the rustling of the wind through the trees. When he reached the planned site, he executed the crash with surgical precision. The car slammed into a tree, and Alexander disappeared into the darkness before anyone could arrive. The following days were a mix of relief and anguish. News reports confirmed the planned success. Millionaire dies in tragic car accident. Photos of the scene showed the wrecked, charred vehicle and planted evidence left by Alexander. His name dominated headlines, sparking conspiracy theories. Some speculated he had fled, but most accepted his death as fact. From a temporary hideout, Alexander watched his life collapse in real time. Richard assumed control of the company, issuing a carefully crafted statement of condolence. "Alexander was an incredible friend and partner," the statement read, while Richard smiled for the cameras. It was a smile Alexander knew all too well: cold, calculated, and entirely false. But vanishing was just the beginning. Alexander knew that clearing his name would require concrete evidence against Richard and anyone else involved. He had no financial resources, his assets were frozen, and no allies to rely on. All he had was his determination and a rudimentary plan. His next destination was Redwood Creek, a remote village he had discovered during his research for hiding places. With limited internet access and a tight-knit community, it was the perfect place to disappear. Taking on a new identity, he introduced himself as David Carter, a man who had lost everything in failed investments. The locals welcomed him with guarded curiosity, but refrained from prying too much. Alexander found refuge in the home of Martha Jenkins, a widowed woman who rented out rooms to supplement her income. Martha was kind but reserved, which suited Alexander's need for discretion. His days were filled with simple tasks: chopping firewood, drawing water from the well, and helping Martha with small repairs around the house. The routine was a stark contrast to the life he had left behind, but in its simplicity, he found a strange comfort. Still, his mind never rested. During the quiet nights in Redwood Creek, Alexander began sketching strategies to expose Richard. He knew it would be a long and dangerous process, but he had no other choice. Slowly, he started integrating himself into the community, frequenting the local market and attending small-town events. Redwood Creek felt like a place frozen in time. Its dirt roads, lined with simple wooden houses, were a stark contrast to the glass and steel skyscrapers where Alexander, now David Carter, had once spent his days. Here, no one cared about his former life. It was the perfect refuge, but also a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Under his new identity, Alexander made every effort to keep a low profile. He avoided lengthy conversations, offering vague, non-committal answers to the locals' questions. "I'm from the big city," he'd say, always with a melancholy tone that discouraged further inquiries. Gradually, he began blending into the small community's rhythm, helping with repairs at the local school or unloading crates at the general store. Though he wasn't close to anyone, he noticed the cautious suspicion of his presence starting to fade. It was during an ordinary afternoon that he met Grace Bennett. He was at the market, picking up bread and a few essentials, when he heard the sound of fruit tumbling to the ground. Turning around, he saw a woman with chestnut hair and intense eyes trying to gather the oranges that had spilled from her basket. Instinctively, he bent down to help. "Thank you," she said, offering a polite but reserved smile. "No problem," Alexander replied, almost forgetting to use his new name. He handed her the last orange, and for a moment, they stood in silence. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity and pain, that seemed to mirror Alexander's own feelings. Grace wasn't a stranger to the village. She was the local schoolteacher and spearheaded small community projects. Despite her calm demeanor, there were whispers about a difficult past, though no one knew the details. Her reserved nature made her a bit of an enigma. Alexander noticed this immediately, though he had no intention of getting close. Their encounters became more frequent, though unplanned. Most were brief, an exchange of greetings at the market, a few words during a community event. Yet every interaction seemed to carry an unexpected weight. Grace had a way of asking simple questions that felt piercing. "You seem like someone who's been through a lot," she said casually one day, leaving Alexander uncomfortably unsettled. Despite his resolve to keep his distance, Alexander found himself drawn to Grace's authenticity. She didn't seem interested in impressing anyone, and her actions were always driven by genuine intent. Unlike the people from his corporate world, Grace had no hidden agendas. That simplicity, so alien to him, began to captivate him. That night, while mentally reviewing the clues that might incriminate Richard, Alexander realized he was thinking about Grace. There was something about her that made him question his own choices. He had never valued personal connections. His life had always revolved around goals and outcomes. But Grace, with her quiet kindness, seemed to disarm him in ways he didn't understand. Life in the village began to shift for Alexander. What had initially been a temporary hiding place now started to feel like something more. He found peace in simple tasks, like helping Martha mend a fence or listening to the local stories at the market. Still, his primary goal remained unchanged, exposing Richard and clearing his name. Grace became the catalyst for the first major breakthrough. During a casual conversation in the village square, she mentioned overhearing something at the market. "Have you ever heard of Willow Corp?" she asked, referring to a company linked to one of the accusations against Alexander. The name set off alarm bells in his mind. It was a shell corporation he recognized. Richard had used it years ago in a shady deal. "Why do you ask?" Alexander worked to keep his tone neutral, but Grace noticed the tension in his voice. "Just something I overheard," she said. "Two men from the next town were talking about it." Sounded important. Alexander realized this could be the first tangible link to the conspiracy. He decided to investigate quietly, but knew he couldn't do it alone. Reluctantly, he began to trust Grace, sharing small pieces of his story. "I'm trying to sort out something from my past," he told her, keeping the details vague. Grace nodded, seeming to understand without pressing for more. Slowly, the two formed an unlikely partnership. Grace, with her natural curiosity and understanding of the community, became an invaluable ally. She knew how to listen without judgment and connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information. Alexander, in turn, began to see the value of working with someone unencumbered by the corporate world's deceit. Their meetings became more frequent, often under the guise of village activities. During their conversations, Grace began to see through the cracks in David Carter's facade. There was something in the way he spoke, the topics he avoided, that hinted at a more complex past. Yet she never pushed. "Everyone has their reasons for keeping things to themselves," she said once, meeting his eyes directly. Alexander realized he was changing. The man who had once trusted only in contracts and lawyers was now learning to rely on a schoolteacher in a remote village. He wasn't sure if this was a strength or a weakness, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel entirely alone. The lead on Willow Corp wasn't just a coincidence. It was a thread in a carefully constructed web, and Alexander knew it. His strategic mind, dulled but not extinguished by months of isolation, began to work as it had during his days leading multi-million-dollar deals. But now, with resources scarce, every move had to be precise. Grace, still unaware of the full weight of her discovery, had become an indispensable anchor. That night, as Alexander replayed every detail Grace had shared, he started to form a plan. He needed to confirm that Willow Corp was still active, and more importantly, find links tying it directly to Richard. However, accessing corporate information from the confines of Redwood Creek posed a challenge. Grace, with her knack for navigating the community, offered an unexpected solution. "I know someone who might help," she said one quiet morning over coffee on Martha's porch. "A friend in the next town works at a local bank. Maybe he can dig up something without raising suspicion." Alexander hesitated. Involving more people increased the risk, but he knew allies were a necessity. With a measured nod, he agreed. In the neighboring town, Grace approached her contact with a carefully crafted story, claiming she was helping a distant relative who suspected irregularities in an old business deal. Intrigued, the contact agreed to investigate. The results were startling. Willow Corp was linked to a network of shell companies funneling vast sums of money, many tied to contracts under Alexander's name. The connections bore Richard's signature all over them. As Alexander reviewed the information, a clear pattern emerged. The transactions had begun months before the accusation surfaced, as if Richard had been laying the groundwork to frame him. Even more unsettling was the appearance of another former associate's name, Walter. Known for skirting the line between legality and corruption, Walter had always been a risky partner. Now it seemed he was deeply entangled in the scheme. Seeing Alexander's darkening expression as he pored over the evidence, Grace asked, "Why would someone go this far to destroy you?" It took him a moment to respond. "Power," he said at last. "Richard always wanted more, but I never thought he'd go this far. He didn't just ruin my reputation. He used everything I built to make himself rich." With the pieces beginning to fall into place, Grace suggested creating both physical and digital backups of their findings. "If something happens, at least we'll have copies," she reasoned. Alexander agreed. They spent hours duplicating the data, hiding physical copies in various locations around the village and securing digital versions on encrypted drives. The investigation wasn't the only thing evolving. Grace began to notice subtle changes in Alexander. He was no longer just the reserved, cautious man who had arrived in Redwood Creek. His actions carried a sense of purpose, but also an unexpected kindness that he might not have recognized in himself. That night, as they sorted through documents, Grace looked at him and said, "You know you're more than this, right? More than what they did to you." He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes revealed that her words had struck a chord. As their investigation progressed, danger crept closer. Henry Wallace, a local known for his nosy tendencies, began noticing the frequent interactions between Alexander and Grace. "David doesn't seem like someone who just wants to be left alone," he remarked to others at the market. His words planted seeds of doubt, and Alexander soon felt the weight of lingering stares and hushed conversations as he passed. Grace confronted Henry directly. "You don't know anything about him," she said firmly. But Henry, emboldened by the attention, didn't back down. "If he's got nothing to hide, why all the secrecy?" he retorted. The situation escalated when Henry stumbled upon an old magazine in a cafe in the neighboring town. On the cover was a photo of Alexander accompanying an article about the allegations. Though his appearance had changed, aged, subdued, Henry made the connection. Without hesitation, he called the anonymous tip line listed in the article, describing Alexander in detail. The call was anonymous, but that didn't stop Henry from spreading rumors in the village. When Grace told Alexander about Henry's behavior, he knew time was running out. "They'll find me," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Grace took his hand. "Don't give up yet. We have enough evidence to expose them. We just have to move faster than they do." The pair redoubled their efforts to consolidate the evidence. Grace tapped into her network to gather additional information, while Alexander focused on mapping out the conspiracy's full structure. Each new discovery brought them closer to the truth and increased the stakes. Henry's meddling brought another complication. Investigators began showing up in Redwood Creek. At first, they asked subtle questions, but their inquiries soon became more direct. Grace, sensing the imminent danger, devised a plan to divert attention while Alexander finalized the evidence. "If they come after you, they'll know something's up. We have to act now," she urged. For Alexander, there was no turning back. The walls were closing in, but the path to vindication was finally within reach. Together, he and Grace prepared for the endgame, knowing that one wrong move could cost them everything. The arrival of detectives in the village marked the beginning of a high-stakes chapter, one where every move Alexander and Grace made had to be calculated with precision. As curious villagers cast watchful eyes, the detectives asked seemingly innocent questions. "Anyone new around here? Or any unusual activity in the past few months?" It was only a matter of time before they found Alexander. Grace, always thinking ahead, suggested a plan to stall them. "I can't delay them," she said confidently. "If we buy enough time, you can secure everything we've found." Alexander was hesitant. He didn't like the idea of her taking on such a risk. "If something goes wrong, they'll connect you to me," he argued. But Grace stood her ground. "You can't do this alone." That afternoon, as the detectives roamed the village, Grace casually approached them in the main square. Feigning ignorance about their presence, she asked if they needed help. They mentioned looking for someone resembling an old photo they carried. "I think I saw someone like that in the next town over," Grace said with impeccable nonchalance. "He left a few days ago, I think." The ruse worked for now. Meanwhile, Alexander began relocating their evidence to a safer location. He and Grace had hidden copies around the village, but it was time to consolidate everything. Using an abandoned cabin deep in the forest, Alexander prepared a temporary hideout, far from prying eyes. As he carried the documents, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was racing against the clock, and one mistake could ruin everything. The detectives, however, weren't easily fooled. A call from Henry Wallace tipped them off to Grace and Alexander's activities. When the detectives returned to the village, Henry eagerly provided details. He described Alexander in vivid detail, noting his routine, his frequent meetings with Grace, and even his occasional trips into the woods. "He doesn't belong here," Henry declared indignantly. Grace learned of Henry's betrayal through Martha, who overheard the detectives discussing him. "They're coming for you," Martha warned urgently. Alexander and Grace acted quickly. "We have to leave now," Alexander said as they packed the last of the documents. The plan was to reach the neighboring city, where Grace had a trusted contact. The escape was anything but smooth. As they made their way through the forest, distant voices reached their ears. The detectives were closer than expected. Grace suggested crossing a stream to throw off the tracking dogs. "They can't follow a scent in the water," she explained. Alexander hesitated, but agreed. The icy water made the crossing grueling, leaving them exhausted. But the strategy worked, at least for the moment. On the other side, they found an abandoned cabin that served as a temporary shelter. There they regrouped, sorting through the evidence to ensure nothing was missing. Alexander, drained, slumped into a corner, clutching the documents that represented his only chance at redemption. Grace sat beside him. "Are you okay?" she asked with genuine concern. "I don't know if this is worth it," he admitted quietly. "Maybe I should just disappear for good." Grace took his hand. "You're not the kind of man who runs," she said firmly. "They've taken so much from you already. Don't let them take the truth." Her words reignited something within Alexander. He knew she was right, but the cost of holding on weighed heavily on him. While resting in the cabin, Alexander combed through the documents once more. That's when he found it, a smoking gun, an email bearing Richard's signature. It outlined specific instructions for funneling funds through Willow Corp, with dates perfectly aligning with the accusations against Alexander. This was the missing piece, a direct link to Richard's betrayal. "This is it," Alexander said, his hands trembling as he held the email. Grace saw the mixture of relief and fury on his face. "He's finished," Alexander said, his voice laced with determination. But Grace reminded him they still had work to do. "Whatever it is, we need to deliver it safely," she said. With the evidence in hand, they decided to leave the cabin at dawn. Grace contacted an investigative journalist in the neighboring city, someone she trusted to handle the information carefully. The journalist agreed to meet in a discreet location. "This could blow everything wide open," he said after hearing about the evidence. "But you need to be careful. If they realize they're being exposed, they might retaliate." The plan was set, but the journey to the meeting, and what awaited them after, would be the most dangerous yet. Dawn arrived with a sharp urgency for Alexander and Grace. They needed to leave before the detectives pinpointed their location. Carrying backpacks filled with documents and encrypted devices, they set out through the dense forest. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig seemed amplified, heightening the tension. Alexander felt the crushing weight of responsibility. The evidence they carried was his only chance to clear his name. Grace, ever vigilant, led the way along lesser-known trails, avoiding areas that might draw attention. "If we move quickly, we can catch a ride on the nearby road," she said, consulting the rudimentary map she had drawn from local tips. Alexander nodded, placing his trust entirely in her. The trek was grueling. Alexander, more accustomed to luxury cars and private jets than physical exertion, felt every muscle in his body ache with fatigue. Grace noticed his struggle, but knew they couldn't afford to stop. "Just a little further," she encouraged, offering a faint smile. "We're almost there." When they reached the road, they spotted an old truck parked near a small rest area. The driver, a middle-aged man named Charlie, appeared approachable. Heading to the next town, he asked as the pair approached. Grace responded quickly. "Yes, we need to get there as soon as possible." Charlie agreed, and they climbed into the back of the truck, hiding their backpacks under tarps covering crates of fruit. The ride was silent, but tense. Grace kept a close eye on the road through a gap in the tarp, scanning for any sign of pursuit. "Do you think they followed us?" Alexander asked, his voice edged with worry. Grace shook her head. "If they'd found us, they'd already be on our trail. But we can't relax yet." They reached the neighboring city by nightfall. Though modest compared to major metropolises, the city's maze of streets and buildings offered the anonymity they desperately needed. Ben Harper, the investigative journalist, was waiting for them at a discreet cafe, tucked behind a bookstore. With his sharp demeanor and ever-watchful eyes, he waved them over as they entered. "Did you get it?" Ben asked without preamble. Alexander placed his backpack on the table and opened it, revealing the meticulously organized documents. "It's all here," he said, his voice steady with resolve. Ben flipped through a few pages, his expression lighting up with the excitement of uncovering an explosive story. "This is enough to bring Richard and everyone involved down," Ben declared. "But we need to act fast. If they catch wind of this, they'll destroy the evidence. Or worse." As Ben began digitizing the documents and sending them to trusted media contacts, Alexander and Grace discussed their next move. "We need to confront Richard at a moment when he can't run," Alexander said. Ben, overhearing the conversation as he worked, chimed in. "You need a public showdown. Nothing is more powerful than exposing them face to face." Ben revealed an unexpected opportunity. Among the emails they had uncovered was one detailing a meeting between Richard and his co-conspirators at a secluded resort. The gathering was scheduled for the next day, making it the perfect opportunity for an ambush. "If we catch them there and record everything, they won't be able to deny it," Ben explained. Grace looked at Alexander with concern. "This is dangerous. They won't just confess because you confront them." Alexander knew she was right, but he also recognized this as his best shot. "I'm not just fighting for myself anymore," he said firmly. "I'm fighting to make sure no one else suffers like I did." With the plan set, Ben arranged for transport to the resort. Grace insisted on reviewing every detail before they left. "We need to be ready for anything," she said, listing potential contingencies. Though Alexander remained focused, he felt the mounting tension. He knew the next step would be decisive, and that it might come at great personal cost. The drive to the resort was marked by silence. Alexander and Grace sat side by side in the car, lost in their thoughts, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. When the resort came into view, Alexander's heart pounded. The imposing building, nestled among the mountains, exuded the opulence of a world he once knew well. "We're here," Ben announced, parking in a discreet spot. He adjusted the hidden camera in his jacket and double-checked the recording equipment. "Remember, the goal is to expose the truth. But stay sharp, they won't go down without a fight." Alexander and Grace exchanged a glance, their unspoken determination reflected in each other's eyes. The moment they had been building toward was here, and they knew the outcome would hinge on their courage and resolve. The resort exuded opulence. Crystal chandeliers and plush carpets set the stage for power plays and secrets. In the grand ballroom, Alexander, clad in a simple suit with dark glasses and a trimmed beard, carried himself with the composed air of a visiting investor. Beside him, Grace wore an understated but elegant dress, its brooch concealing a hidden camera. Together, they blended seamlessly into an environment Alexander knew all too well. At the back of the room, Ben Harper adjusted his concealed camera, poised to capture every detail. "Remember," he whispered before stepping away, "don't tip your hand until we have enough." Alexander nodded, but a chill ran down his spine. One misstep could bring everything crashing down. At the heart of the room, Richard basked in his perceived invulnerability. Surrounded by familiar faces, former business partners Alexander recognized. He gestured animatedly, his voice dripping with the arrogance of unchecked power. Alexander and Grace maneuvered to a nearby table, inconspicuous, but within earshot. The conspirators' conversation was enough to make Alexander's blood boil. "The transfers to Willow Corp are seamless," one said. "The international expansion is progressing exactly as planned," another added. Richard chuckled, raising his glass. "With Alexander out of the picture, the world is ours." It was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. Removing his glasses, he rose from his seat and strode toward the group. His voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Interesting to hear that, Richard." The room froze. Every head turned toward him. Richard's smug expression shattered into disbelief. "You," he stammered, standing slowly. "You're supposed to be dead. That's what you wanted, wasn't it?" Alexander replied coldly. He opened his jacket, revealing a leather folder stuffed with documents. With deliberate precision, he tossed them onto the table. "But as you can see, I'm very much alive, and I brought something for you to review." The conspirators leaned in, flipping through pages of incriminating evidence, financial transactions, fraudulent contracts, and damning emails. The signatures and details left no doubt. Richard was at the center of it all. Behind him, Grace discreetly adjusted the angle of her brooch camera, ensuring everything was recorded. "This is absurd," Richard sputtered, trying to regain control. "These documents don't prove anything. They're fabricated." Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Fabricated? Like the charges you used to ruin me?" "The difference, Richard, is that the truth is on my side." The room began to unravel. The conspirators, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned on Richard. "He assured us no one would find out," one exclaimed. "We were just following orders," another protested. Amid the chaos, one of the men grabbed a stack of documents and bolted for a side exit. Grace's sharp eyes caught the movement. "He's taking the evidence," she called out. This time, Alexander remained composed. Crossing his arms, he watched as two security guards, hired by Ben, blocked the fleeing man's path. The guards seized the documents and restrained him. "You're not going anywhere," one said firmly. Grace shot Alexander a puzzled look, noting his calm demeanor. He gave her a faint smile. "They're just copies," he murmured, the relief in his voice unmistakable. The critical evidence was already digitized and distributed, safe from any attempts to destroy it. With the runaway conspirator detained, Alexander turned back to Richard, who was now visibly cornered. "You destroyed my life," Alexander said, his voice steady but cutting. "You used my company, manipulated everyone around you, and all for your own gain. But now it's over." Richard's composure snapped. His voice rose in desperation and fury. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Alexander. "This won't end here. I have allies' resources. You'll never bring me down completely." Alexander's calm was unshakable. "You still don't get it, do you? You've already lost. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." At that moment, the ballroom doors swung open, and law enforcement entered, flanked by additional security personnel Ben had arranged. The air, once thick with arrogance and power, turned electric with tension and murmurs of fear. One by one, the conspirators were handcuffed, including Richard, who continued to protest even as he was led away. Ben captured every second of the dramatic conclusion, his camera ensuring the events would reach the public unfiltered. Within hours, headlines dominated the news. Ex-mogul exposes web of corruption and corporate conspiracy toppled in stunning showdown. Alexander watched in silence as Richard, now in handcuffs, was escorted out of the resort. Richard shot him one final glare, full of venom and defeat, but Alexander remained unfazed. Grace stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, her smile gentle and warm. Alexander turned to her, feeling a profound mix of relief and gratitude. For the first time in months, he wasn't just a man fighting for justice. He was someone who had reclaimed his life. And in doing so, he had become stronger than he ever thought possible. The drive back to Redwood Creek was heavy with a contemplative silence. Alexander sat beside Grace, watching the landscape blur past the window. The world outside seemed to mirror his inner transformation, slowly rebuilding itself after months of turmoil. His thoughts churned over the events at the resort, the conclusion of a battle that had consumed his life. "You did it," Grace said, breaking the quiet. "Your name is cleared, and Richard is exactly where he belongs." Alexander nodded, but didn't reply immediately. Clearing his name had been his goal, but now it felt like just one part of a greater journey. Something deeper had shifted within him, a change he was still struggling to fully understand. When they arrived in the village, the reception was surprising. Martha, the widowed woman who had rented him a room, stood waiting at her doorstep, her face lit with relief and pride. "You did what you had to do," she said, handing him a cup of tea. "But more than that, you've become part of this place." The villagers, who had once regarded Alexander with suspicion, now greeted him warmly. He was no longer an outsider, but someone who had faced immense challenges and emerged stronger. Yet Alexander didn't let the warmth go to his head. He knew trust was something to be earned every day, not simply awarded after a single moment of triumph. In the days that followed, Alexander began to reassess his life. Redwood Creek, once a temporary refuge, now felt like home. The urgency to return to his corporate world was gone. Instead, he saw the village through new eyes, noticing its needs and imagining how he might give back to the community that had given him so much. "They deserve better," he told Grace as they walked through the village square. Inspired, he began brainstorming ways to invest in Redwood Creek, not for profit, but to repay the kindness and shelter he'd received. Grace supported his ideas, offering practical suggestions for changes that could have a lasting impact. The first initiative was to renovate the local school. Using part of his recovered fortune, Alexander funded the construction of a library, added computers, and provided educational resources the children had never had before. Grace, as the school teacher, played a key role in organizing the new materials and coordinating efforts with the villagers. Next, Alexander turned his attention to the village's roads, often impassable during heavy rains. He hired local workers to carry out repairs, ensuring that the project provided temporary jobs and boosted the local economy. Other projects followed, building an efficient water system and creating a microcredit fund to help farmers and small business owners expand their ventures. "I'm not buying your gratitude," Alexander told the villagers. "I'm just giving back what you've given me." Meanwhile, his relationship with Grace deepened. She was more than a partner in rebuilding the village. She was a source of clarity and purpose he hadn't known he needed. Grace admired his resolve and his willingness to reshape not only the village, but also himself. "You're not the same man who arrived here months ago," she said one evening as they stargazed. "And you don't know how much of that has to do with you," Alexander replied with a quiet smile. He knew Grace had been instrumental in his transformation. Without her belief in him, he might have faltered. She had helped him rediscover what truly mattered. Redwood Creek began to thrive in ways its residents had never imagined. The newly paved roads made transporting goods easier. The improved school attracted teachers from other areas, and local businesses flourished with the help of Alexander's microcredit fund. For the first time, Alexander measured success not in profits, but in the smiles of children, the gratitude of farmers, and the quiet pride of the villagers. "You've changed so much here," Grace said as they walked through the now bustling village. Alexander looked around, taking in the results of their work, and replied, "This place has changed even more in me." One quiet evening, Alexander gathered the villagers for a community meeting. Standing before them with Grace by his side, he shared his story. "I came to this place running, not knowing I was searching for something far more important than refuge," he said. "You've taught me the meaning of community and helped me see that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we share." The applause was heartfelt but intimate. Alexander glanced at Grace, Knowing this was the culmination of one journey and the beginning of another. That night, as they sat under the stars, Alexander made a silent promise. "I'll never forget what this place has given me," he said aloud. Grace squeezed his hand and replied, "And we'll never forget what you've done for it." And what about you? Have you ever stopped to think about what true wealth really means? Is it found in external achievements or in the small, often overlooked moments? Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe true wealth is? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next heartfelt stories we're preparing for you. And before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen right now. I'm sure it will touch your heart and help you see new possibilities. Remember, sometimes what seems like the end is just the beginning of something new. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.